What happens when a lesson ends, but the silence between a teacher and her student says more than words ever could. It was late evening when the last of the footsteps faded from the corridor, leaving the school cloaked in a silence that was almost too heavy. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing, of every creak of wood and every flicker of the fluorescent lights. My classroom looked different at that hour. Shadows stretched long across the desks, and the faint scent of chalk dust hung in the air, mixed with the cleaner's soap. It wasn't a place of lessons anymore. It felt like a stage set for something unspoken. And then there was her. She stood at the front, a stack of papers in her hands, flipping through them with the calm precision she always carried. At 42, she wore her confidence like a well-fitted coat, graceful, polished, and untouchable. But that evening, maybe because the school was empty, I noticed something else. The small curve of tiredness in her shoulders, the way her hair had loosened slightly from its pin, strands falling soft against her cheek. I sat at my desk, pretending to finish notes, though in truth, my pen hovered uselessly above the page. My attention was fixed on her, the quiet rhythm of her movements, the way the lamplight above caught the gold in her eyes. She was my teacher, someone I was supposed to see through the lens of authority and distance. Yet in that stillness, she seemed less like an untouchable figure and more like a woman, human, beautiful, and quietly vulnerable. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. Just a glance, no longer than a breath. But it was enough to send a rush of warmth through me, like I had accidentally crossed an invisible line. She looked away quickly, as if the moment hadn't existed, returning her gaze to the papers in her hands. Still, my chest tightened. I knew she had felt it too. I tried to focus, forcing myself to write something. Anything, but the silence between us grew louder than the scratch of my pen. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of words left unsaid, of questions we both pretended not to hear. Finally, she spoke. Her voice, steady as always, carried across the room. "You don't have to stay late, you know." I looked up, forcing a small smile. "Neither do you." Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but not indifference either. It was the kind of expression that hinted at layers she never let anyone see. And in that second, with the air between us charged in ways I couldn't define, I realized this was no ordinary evening. This was the quiet beginning of something we both knew shouldn't exist, yet already did. The classroom wasn't just a classroom anymore. It had become a space of possibilities, of rules bending under the weight of silence and stolen glances. And though nothing had been said outright, I felt the truth settle deep inside me. We had crossed the first threshold, and there would be no going back. The next day, everything should have gone back to normal. That's what I told myself as I walked into class, sliding into my seat like any other morning. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching flecks of dust in the air, and the low murmur of students filled the room. On the surface, nothing had changed. But for me, the memory of that late evening lingered like a quiet echo. She entered with her usual calm, a stack of graded papers balanced neatly in her hands. Her voice carried with its familiar authority as she called names, handing each sheet back with practiced ease. I kept my head down, waiting, though I felt every second stretch longer than it should. When she reached my desk, time seemed to slow. She placed the paper down in front of me, but her fingers didn't pull away immediately. They lingered just a moment longer than they should have, close enough that I felt the warmth of her hand brush against mine. My breath caught. The contact was so slight it could have been dismissed as nothing. But the way her eyes lifted to meet mine told a different story. It wasn't just a glance. It was a pause, a hesitation, as if both of us were caught in a moment we hadn't prepared for. Her eyes held mine, deep, searching, with something unspoken flickering in them. It wasn't the gaze of a teacher looking at her student. It was the gaze of a woman suddenly aware of being seen, truly seen. I wanted to say something, anything, but words refused to form. Instead, I nodded faintly, pretending to scan the paper, though my eyes barely registered the red markings across it. My pulse thudded in my ears. She Two, seemed to realize the silence between us had grown heavier than it should have. Almost abruptly, she drew her hand back, straightened her posture, and moved on to the next desk. Her voice was steady again, measured, as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the sensation that passed between us, like a spark quick enough to hide, but impossible to forget. The rest of the class blurred. I watched her from the corner of my eye, every movement magnified in my mind. The way she brushed her hair back, the way her gaze lingered for a second longer when she scanned the room, as though careful not to land on me again. She carried herself with composure, but I could see the faintest trace of conflict in her face when she thought no one was looking. By the time the bell rang, my notes were unfinished, my thoughts tangled. She gathered her books swiftly, avoiding my eyes as students filed out. And yet, just before she stepped into the hallway, her gaze flicked back toward me. Quick, fleeting, almost like a secret shared in plain sight. That was all it took. A glance, a pause, and the unshakable certainty that something fragile and forbidden had already taken root between us. The following week, fate, or perhaps something quieter, more deliberate, brought us into the same empty space once again. The last bell had rung, students had scattered into the fading afternoon, and the classroom sat in that half-light between day and evening. I lingered at my desk, pretending to reorganize notes, though the truth was simpler. I didn't want to leave. She was at her desk too, flipping through papers with mechanical precision, though I could tell her thoughts weren't in the pages. There was a faint crease between her brows, a heaviness in her movements. For a long moment, the silence stretched between us, comfortable but charged, until she set the papers aside and looked at me. "You're unusually quiet today," she said, her voice softer than usual. Not the clipped tone of instruction, but something closer to conversation. I hesitated, unsure how to answer without revealing more than I should. "Just distracted, I guess." She gave a small, almost rueful smile. "We all get that way sometimes." Her gaze drifted to the window, where streaks of gold sunlight painted the glass. Then, as if speaking more to herself than to me, she added, "Some days feel heavier than others." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, she seemed less like the figure I'd always known and more like a person, tired, thoughtful, human. Something inside me stirred, not out of pity, but recognition. I wanted to ask, what makes it heavy? But I stayed silent, sensing that the quiet itself was an invitation. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, and her shoulders softened. People think being in control all the time is easy, that because you stand at the front of a room, you have all the answers. She gave a short laugh, though it carried no humor. But sometimes, even the ones who are supposed to guide others lose their way. The vulnerability in her words caught me off guard. I had never heard her speak like that, without barriers, without the armor of authority. My chest tightened with a strange mix of admiration and ache. I wanted to reach across the space between us, to let her know she didn't have to carry it alone. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, letting my voice match her softness. "I think sometimes it's enough just to admit that. You don't have to have the answers all the time." Her eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I felt the walls she kept so carefully in place falter. A stillness wrapped around us, broken only by the faint hum of the lights. Then, almost unconsciously, she rested her hand on the desk between us. Not reaching for me, not deliberate, but close enough that the distance suddenly felt smaller. I didn't move, didn't push, but the presence of her hand there was enough. A silent gesture, heavy with meaning, trust, vulnerability, a crack in the facade. And in that quiet moment, I understood this wasn't about breaking rules or chasing something forbidden. It was about two people seeing each other clearly, stripped of roles and expectations, in the rare honesty that comes when the world finally grows quiet. It was raining that evening, the kind of soft, steady rain that turns the city into a blur of glistening pavements and silver-lit streets. I hadn't planned to see her outside of class, yet fate, or something like it, had a way of weaving our paths together. I found myself leaving the building later than usual, my jacket pulled tight against the damp chill. And there she was, standing just beyond the doorway, umbrella in hand, watching the rain fall like she was caught between leaving and lingering. For a moment, I simply stood there, unsure whether to step forward. She must have heard me because she glanced back. Her eyes softened when they found mine, and she tilted the umbrella slightly, wordlessly offering to share. I stepped closer, the rain pattering just inches away, and suddenly the world shrank to the small circle of shelter we stood beneath. The air was filled with the scent of wet earth, faint perfume, and something warmer, the quiet pulse of closeness. We walked slowly down the deserted street, her arm brushing against mine now and then as we adjusted to fit beneath the umbrella. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence was not empty but rich, humming with everything we weren't saying. Finally, she broke it. Funny, isn't it? How something as ordinary as rain can make the world feel so different. I glanced at her, noticing the way the streetlights reflected in her hair, the way her voice carried a softness it never had in the classroom. Maybe that's why people stop and notice it. It slows everything down. Her lips curved into a faint smile, thoughtful, almost wistful. Sometimes slowing down is exactly what we need. We continued, the rain tapping gently against the umbrella. Each step felt deliberate, like walking not toward a destination, but toward a moment neither of us wanted to end. At one point, a gust of wind shifted the umbrella, and instinctively I lifted my hand to steady it. My fingers brushed over hers where she gripped the handle. She didn't pull away. For a second, we walked like that, her hand beneath mine, the contact light but undeniable. The warmth of her skin against my fingertips sent a quiet current through me, grounding and electrifying at the same time. Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly, but she didn't let go. Instead, she turned her face slightly, watching the rain beyond the umbrella's edge. "It's strange," she said softly, "how something so small can feel so much." I didn't answer with words. I didn't need to. The closeness said more than anything could. When we reached the corner where our paths would split, neither of us moved to step away immediately. The rain still fell, the umbrella still shielded us, and the space between us felt fragile, sacred. Her eyes met mine one last time before she whispered, "Good night." It was simple, ordinary, but the way she said it carried weight, like a promise neither of us dared name. As I watched her walk away, the world felt emptier without her beside me. And yet, my heart was fuller than it had been in a long time. The following days should have been ordinary, yet nothing between us felt the same. That walk in the rain lingered in my memory like a song that refuses to fade, and every time I stepped into the classroom, I carried its echo. But where I felt drawn closer, she seemed to step back into the safety of distance. Her presence was still the same, poised, graceful, the confident voice guiding us through lessons, but now I caught the subtle changes. The way her eyes avoided mine when she addressed the room. The way her laughter sounded just a little forced when someone cracked a joke. She had built the walls higher, stronger, as if that night beneath the umbrella had exposed something she now needed to hide. One afternoon, I stayed behind again, not ready to let go of the hope that maybe the silence between us could be bridged. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. Closing a book with deliberate finality, she looked at me across the empty desks. "You shouldn't linger," she said, her tone calm but firm. "People might start asking questions." Her words stung more than I expected. Questions about what? About staying late to study? About a conversation? Her eyes hardened, though not unkindly. About things that should never be misinterpreted. She hesitated then, as if she heard the weight of her own words. For a moment, her gaze softened, and I saw the truth. This wasn't about indifference. This was about fear. I stood, taking a careful step closer, though I kept the desk between us like a barrier neither of us dared to cross. "I don't want to misinterpret anything," I said quietly. "But pretending there's nothing here doesn't make it go away." Her breath caught, and for a second, her composure cracked. She looked at me not as a teacher guarding her position, but as a woman caught between desire and duty. The silence was heavy, thick with things neither of us could voice. Finally, she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll pretend this never happened. All of it." The words landed like cold water. My chest tightened, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the way her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the desk, betraying tension she wouldn't allow herself to speak. She wasn't pushing me away because she wanted to. She was pulling back because she believed she had to. I nodded slowly, though every part of me resisted. "If that's what you need." She turned her face then, as though looking at me too long might break her resolve. The distance between us felt wider than ever, though just hours ago I could still remember the warmth of her hand against mine. I left the classroom quietly, the echo of her words trailing after me. But even as I walked down the hallway, I knew no amount of pretending could erase what was already alive between us. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. The weight of her words, "We'll pretend this never happened," followed me for days. I carried them like stones in my chest, heavy and unyielding. And yet, beneath the weight, there lingered a spark that refused to die. Pretending had done nothing to erase the memory of the rain, the glance, the warmth of her hand. If anything, the silence only made it stronger. It was late again when our paths crossed. The school was quiet, the kind of quiet that sharpens every sound. The tick of the clock, the faint hum of the lights, the rustle of papers being gathered. I lingered outside her classroom door, unsure whether to walk past or step inside. My hesitation was broken by her voice, soft, almost weary. "You're still here." I stepped in. She was seated at her desk, books stacked high around her, though she wasn't reading them. Her posture was taut, her fingers laced together as though holding herself steady. For once, she didn't hide the fatigue in her eyes. "I didn't want to leave without saying something," I admitted, my voice quiet, almost trembling with the weight of honesty. She looked up at me then, really looked. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Her eyes searched mine, as though trying to decide whether to let the walls stand or finally let them fall. "Do you realize," she whispered, "what you're asking of me? To carry something I shouldn't?" I swallowed hard, stepping closer but stopping short of the desk. "I'm not asking you to carry it alone. I'm asking you not to deny it." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her gaze dropped to the floor, and a silence stretched between us, thick, fragile, and trembling with unspoken truths. My pulse thundered in my ears. For once, I didn't retreat into politeness. "I don't want to forget the moments we've had," I said, my voice breaking with sincerity. "I don't want to pretend they don't matter." Her breath caught, and I saw her shoulders tremble as if the weight she'd carried for so long had finally grown too heavy. Slowly, cautiously she stood, and when she did, her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the vulnerability she had spent years hiding. For a second, she hesitated, caught between the world she knew and the one she was terrified to step into. Then, almost instinctively, she crossed the distance between us. Her hand rose first, hesitant but steady, resting lightly on my shoulder. The warmth of her touch seeped through me, grounding and electrifying all at once. Then she let it linger, her thumb brushing the fabric of my sleeve as though memorizing the moment. "I can't promise you anything," she said, her voice low and trembling. "But I can't keep pretending either." I closed my eyes briefly, the sound of her words sinking deep into me. When I opened them again, I met her gaze with quiet certainty. "Then maybe honesty is enough," I whispered. Her hand slipped down, brushing against mine. Our fingers touched, hesitant but unafraid, and for the first time, the silence between us felt less like a burden and more like a beginning. The days that followed felt different, not because everything had suddenly changed between us, but because the weight of denial was gone. We didn't speak of it openly, not in words that anyone else could hear, but there was a quiet understanding now, in the way her eyes softened when they met mine, in the small pauses that lingered just a little too long, in the silence that no longer felt suffocating but alive. One evening, after the building had emptied and the corridors once again fell silent, I found myself at her classroom door. She was standing by the window, watching the last traces of sunlight fade into the horizon. The glow framed her in gold, softening her features in a way that made her seem less like the figure I had always known, and more like the woman I was just beginning to understand. She turned when she heard me, her expression caught between surprise and something warmer. "You're still here." I smiled faintly. Seems like we both have a habit of staying too late. Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, but her eyes gave her away. There was tenderness there, and hesitation too, but no denial. I walked closer, careful not to break the fragile calm that hung in the air. When I reached her side, I didn't speak right away. Instead, I let the silence rest between us, the kind of silence that carried comfort rather than distance. Finally, she sighed softly, almost like she was releasing something she had been holding for too long. I keep telling myself we should forget, that this can't exist beyond stolen moments. And yet, she trailed off, her gaze returning to the fading light outside. "And yet you don't want to," I finished gently. Her eyes flicked back to mine, startled, then softened as if I had spoken the truth she hadn't dared say aloud. Slowly, almost carefully, she reached out. Her hand brushed against mine, just a feather-light touch at first, then firmer, her fingers curling with a quiet certainty. The warmth of her hand was steady, grounding me in a way words never could. I let my thumb trace gently over her knuckles, committing the moment to memory. She exhaled, a sound that was both relief and surrender. "I'll pretend this never happened," she whispered, the same words she had once used to build a wall between us. But this time, her voice carried no finality, only vulnerability. I leaned closer, not enough to break the fragile boundary between us, but enough for her to hear the steadiness in my reply. "Until next time." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and in her eyes I saw acceptance, not of a future defined, but of a truth shared. We stood there together, hand in hand, watching the last light fade into night. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a reckless promise. It was something quieter, more enduring, a beginning wrapped in stillness, carried by the weight of unspoken certainty. And in that moment, it was enough. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of our slow burn romances. Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the sweetest stories are the ones we experience together.